Welcome to Dialogues in Humanities, sponsored by the Foothill De Anza Center for Applied Humanities. I'm joined here today by author and educator Tony Kashani and humanities scholar and activist educator Wendy White. My name is Maristella Tapia, professor of sociology at De Anza College. Today's panel will focus on the lasting legacy of Bell Hooks, who died this past December at the age of 69. Born Gloria Jean Watkins on September 25th, 1952, Hooks was a prolific writer, authoring more than 30 books, including a number of children's books. Early in her writing career, she took on the pen name of her grandmother, Bell Hooks, and in an homage to the activists of her time, utilized all lowercase letters to write her name, signifying the desire to be primarily known for her words, work, and social activism. Hooks's work was decidedly intersectional and played a foundational role in establishing the body of Black feminist thought and critique that continues to reverberate throughout the world of academia. Her voice was dissenting and critical, not for the sake of being contrarian or controversial, but for the sake of radical openness, a practice aimed at deepening our awareness of ourselves and our biases in search of truth and authentic connection with one another. Hooks was an eclectic scholar. Describing her intellectual approach in her own words, she states, quote, "The genius of Bell Hooks, such as it is that I bring together the standpoints that are often not brought together in our nation. I bring together thoughtfulness about race, gender, class, when I am writing about love. I'm always bringing together diverse ways of knowing. That has been the mark of a Bell Hooks book," unquote. Without further ado, we welcome you to this conversation about the lasting impact of Bell Hooks on our world, our work, and ourselves. So the first question, I'm going to begin with Wendy. Dr. White, can you just tell me a little bit about how you first became acquainted with Bell Hooks's work? And actually, I know, Wendy, that you met her several times and even interviewed her in 1989. Share a little bit about your experience with getting to know Hooks, both in print and maybe getting to know her in person, the real Bell Hooks.
Yes, thank you, Mari. The memory doesn't serve me well, but I believe it was Feminist Theory Margin to Center that was the first book I read of hers. And let me say, I had dropped out of school after 2 years, got into broadcasting and decided to go back to school. I was around 35 in 1988, actually. And so it was actually, I had read her book and I was like, whoa, she was speaking to my reality on so many levels. I was involved in a lot of political organizations, things of that nature. A dear friend of mine was a dear friend of hers. So in 1989, she came to do a presentation, I believe at Pitzer College, which is in Southern California, a part of the Claremont colleges. And it was dealing with cultural theory or popular culture, something of that nature. And so I was really excited to go and hear her. And when I went, Paul Gilroy, who was a Black British cultural critic, was doing a presentation on music. And so afterwards, he had a question and answer period. And I had spent 20 years in the broadcasting industry. So I was offering a perspective from a more experiential approach. And he was kind of dismissive, if you will. And Bell Hooks and I were sitting in the same row opposite section. So I was sitting at one end and she was sitting at the other end. And I remember, because I'd gotten up and stood up and made my comment, and he was kind of dismissive, and Bell interceded, was like, "Oh, no, Paul, you need to listen to this because she's talking about, and so she basically turned the floor over back to me.
Wow.
And it was, the irony was I was giving him experiential evidence for the position that he was making. And I just never forgot that. And then afterwards, she visited with my friend. My friend and I were driving, and I let them visit. And then we were walking back, and she and I got into this intense conversation about healing, about scholarship and what it means, and what I had experienced as a broadcaster. She was very, very approachable. I remember, because I was thinking, boy, she's a powerhouse. And when I met her, she was short in stature, and she had this sweet, innocent face, but she was so fierce in her intellect that I was really taken aback. But I also remember she was so genuine and approachable. Mm-hmm. And I think a year or two later, I met her again. And her sister was with her. So there were like 2 or 3 encounters. And that was one of the things that really stayed with me, that she was rising. She was becoming a household name at that time, but she was so approachable. She was not impressed with herself. She was impressed with her intellect. I don't think she ever stopped being impressed with her intellect, but she was not impressed with herself. And she had shared her phone number with me. When I read Thinking Feminist, Talking Back, when I read Talking Back, I was on fire, because she was speaking even more so to my heart and to my soul. And I remember being able to call her and talk to her, interview her further. There was one time I was living with some people. Folks were all loud. I mean, just really loud, Black folks having fun. And I had to go into the closet and have a conversation with Bell Hooks for about 2 or 3 hours. We were talking about what she had written in the text. And I will forever treasure that memory. I'm really just sorry I didn't keep in touch with her. But she was very real, very approachable, and everything was fair game.
Such a beautiful recounting of just, that memory of her, meeting her as a person, and finding that connection, that authentic connection with someone who is so grand in our imaginations. And thank you for that. Tony, I want to turn it over to you. Tell me a little bit about how you first became acquainted with Bell Hooks's work and what your first impressions were.
Yeah, we all have interesting stories about Bell Hooks. Nothing as compelling as Dr. White's account of the encounter. I never had the honor of meeting her in person. How I came into her work was actually a transformative experience I had. I was at graduate school. This is early 2000, actually late 90s, early 2000. And I was studying film, cinema studies at the renowned program at San Francisco State University. And I was also studying, culture studies and looking at, continuing on into a PhD program, et cetera, et cetera. I was immersed in the graduate work, where we get all excited about new theories, and postmodernism was around, and all of these things. And I was trained in the work of a Frankfurt School, critical theory. And if the folks that are actually watching and listening here are familiar with critical theory, particularly the work of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Walter Benjamin, these guys were into separating high culture and low culture. Thinking that popular culture is not really culture, especially with Adorno, this was the case. He wrote that infamous essay about jazz, where he just sort of disrespected jazz as a major contribution to music. Anyways, I was deeply involved with critical theory, and my wife at the time was also at graduate school, and she was in a women's studies program. So one day, I was coming to one of her classes to just to audit, because I was, auditing different programs, just thirsty for knowledge. And I'm sitting there in the classroom, and there's this videotape being played, and there's this woman talking about popular culture and transgression. And this was like a Media Education Foundation program interview with her, exclusively with bell hooks. And so I nudge my wife and go, "Who is this?" And she goes, "This is bell hooks." And I'm listening, and she solved a problem for me. I had this problem. I was interested in studying culture, but I was seeing that much of culture studies, media studies in America is culture studies. Much of media studies lacks the moral seriousness of discourses around it, right? So it's like Madonna studies decaffeinated kind of a thing. And here she is talking about taking Madonna to task, taking popular culture to task, and then making the connections to capitalist, oppressive, racist complex that culture industry produces. And her words spoke to me directly. I say, "Here is my solution. I can build a bridge between critical theory and the kind of stuff that bell hooks," because I was studying Stuart Hall, and that wasn't really doing the trick for me. And I said, this is the person I need to learn about and read her books. So after that experience, I went and started looking for stuff that she's done. And then I continuously, in my own pedagogy, whenever I'm teaching about culture, film, just recently I finished a semester with students working on ethnicity in American cinema, and I used her book, Reel to Reel, about sex, race, and gender issues in cinema. And it was profound, not only for me, but I think for my students too. So ever since that experience, where she unlocked this problem and then built the bridge for me, I've been a different kind of educator. And of course, her work comes into my writing as well.
Right. And just to kind of follow up on that, you start to talk about the sort of opening she created in your thinking about cultural criticism and media criticism. Can you tell me a little bit about what aspect of her cultural criticism has been really influential to you?
Yeah. As an immigrant male that comes from a different part of the world, and then it gets assimilated to the white culture, if you like, because white supremacy is part and parcel to all of our institutions, including higher ed. So I have adopted the language of dead white men, if you like. And feminism, I was introduced to feminism in my studies. Whenever you study humanities, you study feminism. But there's different, versions of feminism that you learn about. Then there's Gloria Steinem approach and this and that, and the waves and the history. So I thought, well, I know about feminism. I understand this stuff. But when she talks about and writes about and honestly, with transparency about Black feminism, right? That's one area that I was educated on. How to approach Black feminism and recognize the intersection of race and gender oppression that comes from white supremacy. And all of that is under the auspice of capitalism, because it benefits capitalism. That's how, slavery started and all that. So that particular aspect, and then recognizing her criticism of cinema, which, is very transformative for people, and it's a pedagogical art form. Whether we like it or not, cinema is always teaching us something, right? It's a teaching machine. I mean, I firmly believe that. And she did too. So learning about Black feminism was absolutely essential for me. And so I can sit down with my Black feminist friends and be able to have a conversation honestly, and then learn from them by knowing that I'm channeling in bell hooks in the conversation. And I'm forever grateful for that.
Yes, I certainly, for me, recall coming to bell hooks's work when I was about 18 years old and sort of in community college, and just starting to open my eyes to theory, period. You know, as a relatively young college student. And of course, you know, it was through her work that I discovered this lens of intersectionality that I just always felt was missing as an analytical framework for my own life. And her writing has always deepened just levels of awareness of social life for me. You know, and every time I come back to her writing, I discover more and more, and watching her interviews and hearing her talk, I just, for me, it's just such, all her writing is always so multidimensional and layered and nuanced and challenging, right? And that piece that you talk about, Tony, of the importance of her scholarship and her lens as a Black feminist, right? Her focus on the intersections of our lives, because life is messy, right? It's not compartmentalized. I just remember, you know, it being a revelation for me when I first heard her use the term sort of all in one breath, right? White supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And that was like, yes, that's exactly it, right? That's exactly what we live within. This, it's not just white supremacy, and it's not just capitalism, and it's not just patriarchy, and I would add not just heteronormativity, but it's all of those things, right? So I definitely relate so much to what you're saying. While I never met her personally, she was so dear to me because she opened up parts of my thinking and parts of my own self-awareness that became sort of a part of me. And how that sort of an inner voice in a way that helped me just analyze my way through the world and see the world differently. And I remember the fact of being in grad school, right? Because, you know, I just fell in love with bell hooks and became an avid reader of her books. And every single new book that was out, I'd go out and get it. Yeah, I'd go to Mo's Books and run and get it. And I remember being in, you know, my graduate program and being frustrated by postmodern work that we were reading, and feeling quite alienated from it, right? It's a very esoteric language. And although I understood much of what I was reading, I never understood why the authors and the thinkers like Horkheimer and Adorno had to make things so inaccessible. When Hooks was able to just cut right through everything and make high theory accessible to everyday people, for me, that was so important, because I felt more at home with her in her scholarship in that sense. So moving on, I want to come back to Wendy. And Wendy, can you talk about the significance of bell hooks' writing for your life?
Wow. Yeah. So, you know, first of all, I want to piggyback, because we all seem to have been trained in a similar fashion. I was also trained in the critical theory, the Frankfurt School. And, you know, I was frustrated by academe, because there were things that I saw that and would want to talk about from an experiential perspective, that there wasn't that academic, no one was writing about it. No one had articulated that. And then here comes bell hooks. So I think about outlaw culture was the gospel for me, in terms of, because I also dealt with cultural, in terms of popular culture and resisting representation, which was so key for me having gotten into broadcasting in early 1970s and was typically the first one, the only one. And I remember one of my biggest sort of negative experiences, 5 women, 4 other women and I got together, put together audio video production company to tap into what was considered Mesbic money. It was money that was designed by the big production companies for people of color, minority. There was a whole reference to it. And I was the one who slept around our 500-page presentation for our particular company. And I will never forget, it was a woman at the time at, if I'm not mistaken, Fox Studio, who was the most honest and basically said, look, if y'all want to do Black exploitation films, you got the money right now. But what we wanted to do, what we had laid out in our 500 proposal, which was a diversity of representations of the African-American experience, she was like, they're not going to fund you. And she was right. No one funded us. You know, so that whole notion of the significance of representation that Bell Hooks was laying out in terms of popular culture, looking at the films, you know, and how, because they're, you know, folks start talking about things were changing. And this was in the 80s. And she was pointing out, look at this and look at that. She was pointing out to the specificity of the continuation of these negative representations. So I wanted to flag that because of the continuity. But you know, it really hit me how much she had influenced me in when I heard about her death. I was hit. It kind of knocked my breath out that she died, because she's only a year older than I am. So that closeness of proximity, I really, really felt. But I had done an interview with her in 1989 that aired on one of the Pacifica stations. And I went back and listened to it. And there was a point where I had to stop reading her text, because I was like, she's writing about everything, stop. You know, but I realized I had drunk her in. I had so taken her into me. So, but the series of books that I did read, you know, first of all, as an African-American woman, there were so many figures early on, Malcolm X, Dr. King, and a number of other people. There was this mindset that you didn't speak about certain things. You certainly didn't air your dirty laundry. It was the cliche that was out there. For Bell, it was like, I'm putting it out there. And I really, really appreciated that, because I felt I was watching what I was watching in my life, the observation of what not talking about things was doing to people, the frustrations, the inarticulation, not being able to articulate what was going on. And so a whole bunch of people were missing out on the complexity of our lives, the complexity of our oppression, the complexity of, you know, of what was existing. And Bell Hooks was giving voice to just about everything, especially the pain. It was interesting going back to when I met her. Her pain to me was obvious. She wore it on her sleeves, and she talked about it. She continued to talk about it all of her academic life, because that was an important factor. And then the healing process. She also talked about the healing process. She talked about the way we hurt one another, we hurt ourselves. She really delved into the internalized hatred that is produced by the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Right. Okay, because the imperialist factor, that colonial dynamic, was really, really important. And in many ways, she helped introduced for me colonial writers. I mean, I had read Paulo Freire, but then there was Amir Cabral and Amy Césaire and C.L.R. James and all these people that I read. And I think that was really the genius of Bell Hooks, all the things that she brought to, which enabled her to bridge, like I think going back to the statement, Tony, of the Frankfurt School and Adorno and Horkheimer and all those guys. Why, you know, I mean, that was very much the status quo of high culture and low culture, you know, but it's culture, it's in culture in its complexity that really speaks to us and affects us. And that was the other significance that she drilled home, was the often invisible ways that culture permeates our being. I mean, there were so many things that she wrote about, and I love that life, because she was talking about life and all of its complexity. I went back to school to really do documentaries, produce documentaries, but I got turned on to philosophy. So here was a peer that was into the same things that I was, really wanting to talk about the significance of theory in life, the significance of philosophical beliefs in life and how they manifest sociologically, psychologically, in terms of cultural practice, how they appeared in film, how they appeared in music, in art. All of those things, seeing those interconnections, because that's what I was experiencing. So she spoke to my soul. Her writings spoke to my soul. That's, I mean, you know, I've gone back and started rereading things, and it has made me realize just how much I drank her in and how much I miss her. And how relevant, I mean, and how the insight that she had, the courage that she had to take on the topics that she did. You know, I mean, girlfriend took on Beyonce, you know, the goddess for a generation, and she was like, I ain't having it. She took on 12 Years a Slave, that for many people it was a monumental film. She was like, the depiction of Black women, I ain't having it, you know. And so that she wanted people to reflect, to really think about what we were, those things that we often don't think about, that, you know, the necessity of pleasure, right? You know, chilling, enjoying something, but it's like, okay, but you still have to be able to critically think, you know, and that her willingness to critically think about everything was perhaps the most significant. The talk of love, love among and between, and the talk of pain between those you love and who's supposed to look out for you and take care of you. Her writings were just so rich. I could talk forever about all the things.
I love that answer. It's you know, so much there, Wendy, that you just gave to us, and thinking about her impact and her legacy, and just how deeply personal so much of her work was. And, you know, as you just touched upon it, this sort of ethic of love that reverberates throughout her work, for me, was really influential, because I was a person who was very much interested in radical thought, very much, you know, interested in reading the words of, you know, anti-colonial theorists that you just mentioned, and also activists, and very much into organizing. And, as a young person, really enamored with these large, charismatic, revolutionary personalities like Che Guevara, and I think Hooks was able to bridge this sort of radical thinking and radical action and activism and movement that was so often motivated by righteous anger and rage. And she was able to bridge that with also love. And for me, it was the first time that I thought about things in that way, that we organize and we're activists and we fight, not just because we are angry and not just because we are enraged and not just because we are fed up, but also because we are in love with our communities and we love, ourselves and the idea of what our communities could be, when we reach to that other end of healing that you mentioned, that line of, that theme of healing that runs sort of as a through line for her work, I think has been super, super important and influential for me too. And I think that I was also impacted when I heard that she died. I remember I was at a grocery store standing in line and I was flipping through my phone and, I got a notification, Bell Hooks dies at the age of 69. And it just, it took my breath away. I felt like I was hearing that one of my relatives or friends died. And, it's just the impact that she had on so many people because she was completely unafraid, it seemed. I don't know, I don't know if she was, but she certainly seemed like she was. And she was completely unafraid to just be vulnerable in her work. And so I want to ask the same thing of Tony. Tony, what stood out for you about Bell Hooks as a scholar or a writer or a teacher or a cultural critic?
Yeah, well, let me just say that this is an enlightening conversation we're having. Not only the fact that we're focusing on the legacy, the lasting legacy of Bell Hooks, who's been influential in all of our lives and many others besides, I am sure. But also this conversation itself is bringing up foundational thinking for my own work. When she talks about the notion of entitlement, right? One thing that I always appreciated with her was that, of course, the notion that if you're born into a privileged situation and you go to these, famous schools, and she worked at all of these places, the Ivy League, as well as the local, liberal arts colleges and so on. And I have too. So, but at the time that I was introduced to her work, I was working with underprivileged kids at the community college. And one thing that she taught me was that tell these kids that you're just as smart as those kids who think that they can change the world, right? Because they come in to the places of higher ed thinking that they are entitled to these big, jobs afterwards and positions of society and so on. And they have the college life and all that. Whereas all these other kids, they're just struggling to survive. And they think that, someday I'll have a degree, and many of them are the first generation college graduates and their families and so on. But what they don't see, and ideology operates this way, of course, right? Constantly telling them that, somehow you just don't get it, right? You're just not good enough, but you'd be good enough to be the functionary in this aspect of society and so on. But she bravely talks about that, says, look, let them know they are just as smart. And in fact, for me, for my work, I've experienced that they also have an advantage to these other kids that are born and raised and just move on seamlessly into powerful situations, is that they have the advantage of knowing about the other side. So the empathy, you talk about ethic of love, the empathy is right there because we build empathy, right? And so another thing I appreciated on the same trope of thinking that she wasn't afraid to talk about courage, and you both talked about her courage. she wasn't afraid to go against the career opportunists in the film industry, in the academia. Academia, we know that the politics of academia. So many pretenders, so many, fraudulent people who know the language of the academe, and they know how to get into places, playing with identity politics, playing with, words, and just being postulating, right? Posturing theory, not having real theories. She had real theory, and she wasn't afraid to be shunned, to be marginalized. It wasn't about that. It was about, right, scholarship that matters, scholarship that speaks to the people. And this is one of the things that she did. And so I was, she's one of my intellectual mentors, and just as others have been, so I think that my work is, if I value my work, I owe it partially to Bell Hooks as being one of the top intellectual mentors for my work. So the courage, if you're a public intellectual, as she was, meaning that you go out there and speak to the public because you see it as not just because something you want to do, become famous or infamous in other circles, because it's your moral duty to do so. And she wasn't afraid to talk about, and like, you were talking about, and she took on 12 years a slave and the Django, and all these things that she took on Spike Lee, right? And his Achilles heel of being not being aware of his chauvinism and sexism, but she also appreciated Spike Lee's contribution to the wider culture, and his films being, monumental films and so on. So this is another area that she can be a teacher for so many scholars that are afraid. Saying, no, don't be afraid. If you're truly committed to notions of social justice, you're committed to be an intellectual that does the intellectual labor work of connecting to the public, then don't be afraid. Your career will take care of itself, right? Because it's really easy to fall into this space where you start, pretending, and the next thing you know, you're not pretending anymore because you are that pretending person. You're nothing but a posturing person. And I see it in so many spaces in academia. One last thing that I want to say in reference to this question, this question that requires many hours of discussion, is that her work was also beyond interdisciplinary, because if you study sociology, Max Weber and Zygmunt Bauman and all these people, they were influential. If you study psychology, if you study culture studies, which is always interdisciplinary and so on, if you study philosophy, you notice that, there is no separation between these disciplines. We have artificially, right, arbitrarily created these separations. She understood that, but she didn't say it in so many words. She just said it in her work, and you could see. And I was learning that this is what it means. And let me just be bold and call it transdisciplinary approach, right? When you go beyond the discipline, you bring all these disciplines in, but you don't separately with segregation, bring them in. You bring it all together. And of course, John Dewey was a big philosopher that sort of promoted this approach. But Bell Hooks in contemporary times, talking about borrowing from Dr. White, imperialist, patriarchy, capitalistic, all these notions that, many other, scholars like Patricia Hill Collins talks about the matrix of domination. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality and all that. But Bell Hooks was already doing that work. Right? She was doing it with a different language, the language that goes directly to the person who could be a freshman in college or a person who has a doctorate and full professorship and all that stuff. We could all learn from that. And that's what I always appreciated with her work. And
Absolutely. And that idea that you just shared with us of her being your intellectual mentor, and Wendy, that you also, resonated with you in terms of her teaching you, right, about how things connected, about being authentic in your work, about, being transgressive in your work. I wanted to ask, Bell Hooks as a teacher, how have her writings impacted you as teachers, you as educators? I mean, we are all familiar with, her work on teaching, teaching to transgress, her book that looks at the practice of education as a transgressive practice. So Wendy, can you talk about that? Talk about how Bell Hooks's work has influenced you as an educator, you in the classroom.
Yeah, so she really, she spoke to my soul. First of all, there were so many things. Dialogue. She underscored the significance of discussion. And that ability to connect things. So one of the things I think about, because I was in love with her and Cornel West, and I was in love with both, because both of them, what I loved about them was that and Cornell's still alive, is that they loved the life of the mind. They love to read, okay, and that's the other thing that I love. But that reading was not limited to books. That reading involved text, involved the visual things that we encounter in our lives, and it involved us, our inner world, as well, as well as the outer world. And so she was able to make connections with the street theory, and the ivory tower theory. And she could weave these bridges. So, as again, the notion that life you bring to the classroom, you bring who you are to the classroom. So dialogue, and to critically think about what you have been told, what you observe, what you have read, that you and what you yourself do, because that everything is up for grabs. And you dialogue around it, and it's in that dialogue. I love the fact that and Tony, you brought this up about, she was the first one that I understood the significance of agency, that you had agency, that you did not have to accept. She underscored for me in the African-American tradition, the oppositional thinking, that so many Black people never lost sight of the fact that, I know who I am. I'm not what they say, I deserve this. And that also came through. And that's also what I bring in my teaching, the significance of the imagination. Oh, that was at the crust of my dissertation. Is there another way to be human? Because human, as articulated in the Western tradition, is unbelievably problematic. And having an imagination, what do you want? What can we do differently? How can we do this differently? That was the other thing that her writings, her scholarship, her discussions reinforced for me. So those are all things that I bring into the classroom. My authenticity, to not be afraid to be vulnerable, the significance of vulnerability, the significance of calling things out, because not only are we as people of color, as women, okay, and as oppressed and dominated individuals, we have agency. But likewise, the oppressor is just as messed up. The oppressor is just as harmed by the dynamics that they create to oppress in our society and in our world. The significance of understanding, I talked earlier about she was the one that really opened up for me, looking at anti-colonial literature, decolonial literature, okay? And the significance of making the connections in terms of what goes on for African Americans, for indigenous folks and Latin Americans and all folks who have experienced who've had that colonial experience. That literature is so rich, and we don't get enough of that here in these United States, because I haven't taught history in a long time, but my history teaching and my world history teaching and my US history teaching, I always try to bring in colonial literature. I'm teaching a class right now about storytelling in American culture. Well, we think we're the only Americans. Hello, I mean, so I mean, there it is. The significance.
Yes, challenging narratives.
Yes, critiquing that and challenging, and then, but more importantly, getting us to think about how can we do things differently. What would we do differently? What is out there that is different? The significance of creativity and the imagination are also key factors. And I know I can go on and on, so I'm gonna.
Tony, same question.
Bring it back.
Same question.
Same question. How has bell hooks impacted your teaching or affected what you do in the classroom?
Okay. Well, ever since I started teaching, and I've always taught in higher ed, so I haven't done K through 12 to the extent where I can speak to that level of teaching, because it's a different approach. Critical ages enter, but in higher ed, I have done work all the way from like freshman level to doctoral level, which I currently do. I work at different places teaching students who are going to be, our peers at some point. And the students are just starting out and they're like, wide-eyed and what is going on here? What is this all about? Oh, I have a syllabus. I'm responsible for everything I do here. They're not going to tell me exactly what to do step by step and all that. So I channel in different intellectual mentors to help me in the classroom. And so I teach to autonomy of thinking. I let the students know the thinking is a lonely business, but we're all together, we're interdependent. And going against the grain, something that bell hooks did all the time, whether it was in front of a camera talking to people, or in the classroom, or in her writing, or perhaps, and Wendy can speak to this, in person with friends and colleagues. So I learned transparency in the classroom is important. And then you become vulnerable, of course, right? Because you're prone to make mistakes, you're prone to be challenged, sometimes rationally, sometimes irrationally. You're prone to be challenged by logical fallacies that come from your colleagues talking about your pedagogy, So I don't care. Right. And I owe part of this attitude of I don't care to bell hooks, who I thought, well, okay, she's being herself, and she's not afraid to take on anybody or take on any kind of like an institution or statuses that it cannot be. Some people think, oh, this is untouchable, don't go there. She went there. And I teach my students that, like the book that you cited, Tapia, Teaching to Transgress, be transgressive. Where there's power, there is resistance. Resistance and power go together, right? And she understood that intuitively, perhaps, or it was the product of so many years of experience and writing, teaching, learning, because she's a consummate, learner, and that's who we are, right? If we're educators, we're learners perpetually. So to transgress, to not be afraid to challenge, and I encourage my students. So yes, you got the salt shaker, your grain of salt with everything, right? whatever I say is not the gospel, right? You can challenge me, and I want you to challenge me so I can become a better teacher. And if I don't get challenged, I think, oh, hey, man, I'm the shit. I can, I know it all. And we all have these tendencies, particularly, being male in a society that just gives automatic privileges to us. I can walk into a room and assume the position of all knowing, all in control and all that. But if I'm vulnerable and I recognize that, is part of the human condition, the vulnerability, and don't cover it up, then I have an opportunity to transform. And if I show that to my students, I think they understand. Young people don't get enough credit for their intelligence and their ability and the capacity to bring it in. And so with observing her work and reading her work and then seeing her in front of the camera and so on, I recognize that, hey, this is what I was looking for. This is what I want to be. I don't want to be like all these other people in the Ivy Tower thinking, oh, the illusion of self-importance and all that. That's not me. Where's the authenticity? We talk about authenticity. Does it exist? Is it, all the stuff. If the closest thing to authenticity is just be who you are, and then just let it out there and see what happens. The sun still comes up the next day, Anyways, like the rest of us, I can go on for hours talking about it. Time is limited, of course, right?
And so, because we don't want to go on for hours, I'm going to bring us to our closing question. So much going on in our world today, some of it beautiful, but a lot of it not, a lot of it really scary. We're living in an era where we might perhaps pretty soon realize the ending of Roe v. Wade and the right of women to have autonomy over our bodies and be granted that human right of choice of what we want to do with our flesh and blood. And just this past weekend, a white supremacist drives 200 miles to a predominantly Black community that has been ravaged by years and years of neglect and institutionalized racism, fought for this Tops grocery store as one of the only grocery stores in an otherwise food desert, finally got it in 2014, only to see this incident evolve where this young man murders Black women and men just out of pure hate. I mean, there's so much to hold, so much heavy and sadness, heaviness and sadness in this world, and then there's also this promise that Bell Hooks is writing and her thinking and her ethos in a way gives to us. And so I just want to end on that. And Wendy, if you can start, maybe just some closing thoughts on how Bell Hooks would want us to move forward in the world that we inhabit today.
Yeah, wow. I think, first of all, she would want us, she modeled for us. And so she would, echoing what Tony said, she would want us to be, but she would want us to have the courage to be and to use our critical thinking, to not be afraid of our love, to not be afraid of our vulnerability. But likewise, I think she would also want us to go to her institute, that very real institute that she put up at Berea College in Kentucky, where she left her papers. I mean, she was prolific, but who knows what didn't get published that also has a possibility to speak to today. So I think she would also want us to look at what she left and to pick it up and to keep it going. Because I think that was clearly at the end of her life, I think she really, really understood that about because she was so prolific. She would encourage us, to do what we feel we need to do in terms of however we see our gifts or talents, to use them, but to have the courage, and to speak up. I think that imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy would then add words like hetero, okay, like you said, Mari, and to keep adding to it, okay, but to keep imagining, to not be afraid to be creative, to be courageous in our own creativity and articulation. She would also encourage us to be quiet, to have quiet time with ourselves, to really allow ourselves to be, to experience what is going on with us, both in terms of our emotions and in terms of our thoughts. Because she also made space for that, to not be afraid to talk about those things that we cannot see, that we cannot measure, that realm that we often talk about in terms of religion and God and spirituality, which we so need today to open up in so many of our sisters and brothers' hearts.
Absolutely. She became a Buddhist towards the sort of latter part of her life. It's something that you share in common with her. Perhaps, you spoke to her about Buddhism as well.
Yes. Well, she also went back. She went back to Christianity. She was born a Christian. She went back. She would attend a evangelical church, I believe, but it was pretty progressive in Florida. She would converse with a minister, so she went back. She was not contained. And I love that. I mean, talk about a wild woman. She, just so happens to be my initials, the wild woman. She was who she was, wild in that sense. Yeah, she was not contained. She did not fit neatly into any box. That's nature. Yeah. Nature. So there it is. I'm sorry.
Yeah, again, her hunger to bring together just different standpoints. And I remember, going to a talk once where she was asked the question, if you had one book to take with you on a desert island, which one would it be? And she shared with the audience that she would have the Raft Is Not the Shore, and it was a conversation between Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently also passed
shortly after she did,
renowned, right, and Daniel Berrigan, who was I believe a Christian, a pacifist, right? Both of them who were writing about the war in Vietnam and their anti-war teachings and spirituality centered around peace. And so I always took that away with me, and I think that Hooks would very much want us to continue down this path towards healing, that she wrote so much about. Tony, what are your closing thoughts, your last sort of words about how you feel that Hooks would want us to move on in the world we inhabit today?
Yeah. Let me just say that, you were talking about wild woman being outside the box. There's so many people in intelligentsia that talk about this, right? It's like the mantra, think outside the box. This is what we want to do. And what they really are not doing in practice is thinking outside the box. They want to create a new box that, has a lot of performative activism and that sort of stuff in it. Every university and college right now is, generally speaking, issuing statements condemning what happened with the shooting in Buffalo and all that. But I don't think if Bell Hooks was around right now, she would be doing that. She'd be talking about, hey, let's go after this white supremacy and power from bottom to top, and then push against it, and don't pay attention to these politicians and academics and all that the talk a big talk, but in action they do nothing. So I hope her legacy brings her to history as not just a Black feminist, though she was, and helped us build theories around these and then take action, right? Be scholar practitioners for feminism, but also a giant among giants of intelligent, authentic, outside the box thinker, right? Just being bravely going to places where you could just fall off the cliff, but not be afraid of doing that. Then just coming back up, climbing right back up, then moving forward, right? Like that Samuel Beckett saying that you fail once, next time fail better. So, right? I think she lived that. Going back to Kentucky, and she could have had all kinds of different, luxurious situations and lucrative positions anywhere. She went back to her roots in many ways. So what I think she would have wanted, and conjecture, of course, but based on our deep impressions of her work and always remaining consistent with her authenticity. Never have I encountered an interview or a book that she wrote where she was pretending to be something else, or always, consistently bell hooks, the one who is just really destroys the box. Right? So I hope that when interviews happen, when people write books, which they will, right? It's not just this, couching it as going to one person who was a colleague of hers and all of that, and just creating these little short narratives that are romantic for folks to read about, but going after it, like, this is what she taught us, and then we can use her work in teaching others, right? So she was the teacher of teachers, and like I said, a giant among other giants, a history of thought and life of the mind. You want to know about life of the mind, right? Her picture, her name, her list, bibliography of her work needs to be on that list when you want to introduce people, or what is life of the mind all about, right? So that's how I feel about it, and then how I passionately go after it. So every opportunity I get, if somebody gives me the opportunity to talk about these things, her work, her name, and what she's done for me as a person individually also is going to be part of that conversation. So what can I tell you? That's how I feel about it.
Thank you. Well, this concludes our panel discussion on the lasting legacy of bell hooks. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.